What do you what do you use to record your podcast, by the way?
I'm just you. I just you. Oh, actually, I don't. I send my little Zoom files, which I have like it turns into like 4 or 5 different files, like audio, video for each of us. We only use the audio,
Mhm.
obviously, but and then I send it to a producer, and I don't know what happens after that.
That's amazing. Oh, so you just do like a Zoom recording?
Yeah, I just use a
Oh, that's
Zoom
great.
recording. If it's in person, I use GarageBand. I'm toying with like I'm hearing about some other sort of sites that might be better
Mhm.
for podcasting, but it's been it's worked well so far.
That's
And
amazing. Yeah, I feel
just
like during the pandemic, especially like when people could not record in person, there were a couple programs that I remember seeing, but I feel like if you can just do it like this, that's great.
yeah, I think it's just the fewer barriers of and potential confusion or like technical difficulties. I feel like it's better. So we'll see. I also am understanding the more of these that I'm doing and just like getting deeper into the podcast world a little bit. I'm seeing the benefit of actually having studio space to record and sort of eventually plan on doing that. Currently I have 2 kids and they were both not supposed to be here, but they're both here today because one um got sick at school. He threw up at school, so I had to go pick him up. And the other, the 3-year-old, the babysitter canceled, but she's she's napping or like having quiet time. So hopefully it'll be fine. But I don't. I was thinking, I was like panicking to my friends. I'm like, I have my interview with Michelle Lee today, and they're like, "Don't worry, she's a mom. She'll understand. Like if
Oh,
there's
I
interruption."
more than understand. My 3-year-old is she just started preschool a couple of weeks ago, so she would be here, but she's at preschool. But the thing is, I think one of the things again that the pandemic brought was that everybody gets it, right? That it's like I was in a meeting and then my husband walked in. You know what I mean? It's like we're kind of all just used to a cat jumping up and like putting their butt right or
Yeah,
something.
I had a previous guest had a parakeet. Like it's her pet, but they're really connected. This parakeet's like really intelligent, and he would kind of come up to the camera every now and then, and all I'd see would be like this fluff of feathers. But it was, it was great. It's real life, and so hopefully we'll get through this. How are you on time? Is like going to 4 o'clock okay for you, or closer to
Totally. Yeah, yeah.
4? Okay,
That's
just
totally
to
fine. I had to do the math because I'm West
Oh,
Coast. I was like,
sorry. You're
totally fine.
why do I think you're in New York? Were you in
So
New York?
I was up until 2.5 years ago. So we moved to LA, and so we've been here for 2.5 years. Did like a whole pandemic move, and yes, I was just back on the East Coast a couple of weeks ago for a wedding and a birthday party, and it was so nice. I miss it.
Where in LA are you?
So we're in Beverly Hills. We had just moved into a new house back in August. And so, yeah, it's been nice. It's been like a big adventure. And, I was always one of those people who I was like lifelong East Coaster. And then when we came out here, like my entire life, I was like, I like LA. I just don't think I could live here. And so now that we're here, I was just saying to someone earlier today, it feels like we're on an extended vacation and I still don't feel like I live here yet. And someone this past weekend told me it took her 10 years to feel like LA was home. I was like, okay, I've got a while to go still.
Yeah. Were you born East Coast?
I
Like
was born East
born
Coast.
North?
Yep. So
Right.
I was actually born in upstate New York and then grew up mostly in Connecticut until I was 16. And my dad got a job in Florida. And right in the middle of high school, moved down to Florida, South Florida, which was like massive culture shock. And then stayed down for college and met my soon to be husband when I was down there. He also had grown up in the Northeast. And so the two of us moved up to Manhattan. We lived there for almost 10 years together. And then when I got pregnant with our first, we moved out to the suburbs. And so we had kind of always been
Mm.
out in the suburbs in New Jersey, but always, like I said, sort of like along that whole East Coast.
I think that's why I associate you so much with New York. And I think when I first found your profile a few years ago, you must have still been in New York because like I just connected you to New York. Um, but wow, Florida, that I think any move during school years for a child is like feels like the worst thing ever. Like
Yep.
I grew up in the Bay Area and we moved like from the city of Cupertino, one city over to Los Altos, but it took me out of the school district. And it was it was at the end of 8th grade. So it was like going into high school, and I was devastated. I was just like, I don't know anyone. It's like a world. I mean, it was literally like a mile, like the move was a mile or something. But
Yeah.
it's
That's
like,
the toughest age though. Like right at that 8th grade, like you're going through so many things. Your friends are so important to you. You know, I think any move around that time is really difficult. But for sure, when I was 16, I used exactly those terms. I said, this is the worst thing ever. And actually, in hindsight, it ended up being the best thing ever because when I was growing up in Connecticut, which is probably very different from you growing up in the Bay Area, since I think there's like a lot of, it's a big Asian American community. Growing up in Connecticut was not that way whatsoever. And so we were the only East Asian family in town
wow.
where, again, like when you're a kid, you don't even notice. Like at some point, you just go, this is weird. I don't look like everybody. And then usually around middle school, that's when it starts to kick in for people that, you know, I got ruthlessly bullied. And didn't understand like why at the time. And so then when we moved down to Florida, suddenly I was in this place that was like incredibly diverse. And so in hindsight, again, like even though I thought it was going to be the most terrible thing ever, it actually ended up being so wonderful because it also opened up my horizons too of like what life should be. And like, you know, the places that I live now, I really like any place that we've chosen to live, I always look at like, what is the diversity like? Because I want to make sure that our kids, wherever they go to school, that they don't have the experience that I did, and that also like they're really exposed to a lot of different like, you know, cultures and ethnicities and other things, because I think it's super important.
That's really, it's like, because Connecticut's very it's kind of, I mean, I guess I can't speak for the entire like, you know, state, it's a state, right? Yes, the state. But it's no, I have an instant picture that pops up when I think Connecticut, and certainly Asian families are not like really don't really factor into that.
Definitely. And what's hard is that like, you know, you live in New York, we live in LA now. Both of these cities are incredibly diverse. And so what's hard to think about sometimes is that, you know, in plenty of places around the country, it is still incredibly not diverse. And so I think, you know, I think social media obviously has been like a great equalizer in that, like, you know, even if you live someplace that's like not diverse, you can still learn a whole lot about people through other channels, watching YouTube, right? It's like there's always someone who you can find that looks like you. But I also think like sometimes we're so insulated on the coasts, not understanding how like other places in the rest of the country are.
Well, I think that's why, like, during the kind of the height of anti-Asian hate crimes during the pandemic, and when it was like just all over the news, right? Like there was that point where nobody didn't know about it. And the conversations I was having with my friends, like my Asian friends were like, not surprised in a way because of the similar things that you experienced growing up, being bullied or made fun of, or all of these things, or, you know, othered. We were kind of like, oh, well, you know, this makes sense. But my non-Asian friends were like so many of them were just shocked, you know, well, partly because like the people in my life don't hold those beliefs themselves, but also just weren't informed that this is what we grew up in. This is the system that we grew up in. And yeah, it just was like, I mean, I think I still hold so much emotion around it. And it like left it like, you know, it had lived its news cycle and then it was gone. But it's still a reality, whether maybe not thankfully in like the numbers of crimes. I mean, it's like crazy that this is the way we have to talk about it, like relationally, but like the racism is still there, the discrimination is still there. And I think like alongside it has been this amazing, beautiful rise of like Asian presence in the culture, and so many things to be excited about media wise. And I think also there's in fashion and beauty too, like we're seeing it more. And everywhere from the faces that we're seeing in magazines to people ask me about like, I'm Korean, and people ask me about Korean skincare all the time. And I'm like, I don't really know actually, because I never lived in Korea and I'm not familiar with like the 10 to 12 step skincare stuff, but it's like, it's like in the, like it has a place now in
Yeah.
everyday culture. So that's like the good and the bad, I feel like are happening in tandem.
Yeah,
Um,
definitely. Well, I feel like a lot of it when it comes to the bad and like the sort of, blind eye to a lot of the issues does boil down to the whole model minority myth, right? That it's like there are a huge number of non-Asian people that kind of look at our community and they just think like, oh, you guys are so lucky. You're so blessed. You all are amazing at math and you all went to Harvard and you all make seven figures and da da da, whatever. And so I think that that's been obviously like such a big issue. And people also kind of don't understand, oh, well, why is that an issue? Like that everyone thinks that you're successful and, whatever, that you make a lot of money and you're good at math. But ultimately it's like, when we think about what happened in Atlanta with like the spa murders and everything, it's like, it is such a damaging thing because so actually in New York City, there's this great organization called Apex for Youth. And so I've been involved with them. I've been to their amazing gala and they do incredible, incredible work. They raise money, but they also have this amazing mentorship program to help underprivileged Asian youth who live in the city. And so I remember years ago, going to one of their events and they were talking about how actually the number one community in New York City that lives under the poverty line is Asian Americans. And so most people don't know that, right? Because again, like the model minority myth, everyone thinks that we're fine and like it's all good. And actually someone in my lifetime, several times actually, has said to me, are you white? Like they, like questioning, like as an Asian American, like, are you considered to be white? And so because we have not been a community historically that's like had a very loud voice in this country, people just don't know a lot about us, I think. And so it is really good that, like you said, through media, entertainment, fashion, beauty, like on all sorts of fronts, like our culture is starting to become much louder. I do actually think when you mentioned fashion though, I think there were some incredible fashion designers back in the day, Philip Lim, Prabal Gurung, but also like influencers too. Like I feel like the wave of first like Asian Americans who I saw start to become really prominent were like the Christelle Lims, Ami Song, Vanessa Hong, you know what I mean? Where I felt like, oh my gosh, I see these people and they look like me. And it's actually such an amazing thing to know that through culture, through fashion, through entertainment, that like those people help to make a change. I am friends with a lot of those people now. And it's like, I still look at them as like being big sources of inspiration because we needed to see their faces and like they were there like very early on.
Yeah. And for seeing people looking amazing, doing amazing things, being recognized and feeling that kinship, if only it's like, oh, they look like me and all this, you can fill in all these blanks about what that means. It makes us feel like, oh, I can take up that space too. There's like, if I am seeing these people viewed in this way, then maybe I can also be viewed in that way versus I always think of this like the I'm watching Full House reruns with my
Mhm.
my older my
Like the
9-year-old.
original one?
The original
Oh,
ones, yeah.
wow.
Yeah, it's on Hulu, I think, yeah. And I just tried playing. We just were looking for something to watch one day and I saw it and I'm like, "Hey, mom used to watch this when I was a kid. Do you want to watch it?" And he was like, "Eh," but he thinks it's really funny, and it's very wholesome every episode. Did you watch it growing up?
Oh,
Yeah, okay.
I think I've probably seen every episode.
Yeah, yeah. And so it's like cue the moral of the story music about 2 minutes before the end of the episode and it's like quite nice. But you probably remember the token characters that were part of the show, right? There was I feel like only one Asian character and he was really geeky, like really like you laughed at him. That was the point. And so seeing that and variations of that and all the other shows, if we were represented at all, like when you're a developing child, it makes you think, so it like puts that limit. It makes you
Yep.
think like, okay, well, firstly, there's hardly room for me because there's only one person that looks like me on in the show with like a sea of, everyone else. And two, if I do get there, ooh, I'm like pigeonholed to be like this type of character. And it's been a real flip over the last, I don't, at least decade, I guess. And to your point, like with the advent of social media and people coming in, Asian people coming in and just like owning the space and just being really celebrated for it. So I hope that our kids, are like, that's just what their experience is going to be. Not like, oh, hey, remember that show where people who look like us were only, portrayed as being really dorky. But all those people you mentioned and just being like, oh, wait, there's actually all this that, and it's so, and for it to be normal for them,
Yep,
like,
completely. Well, we're moving into a time when we're allowed to be portrayed as full human beings, right? As opposed to just like cliches and stereotypes. And so I'm a child of the 80s, and like I very much sort of identify with like 80s and 90s movies. Like I love the, all of that media, etc. But it's true that if you look back on a lot of it, it's kind of terrible. Love all like the John Hughes movies and stuff, but it's like obviously people sort of look at like that Long Duck Dong character and like Full Eyes, and like other movies. Like I feel like especially being an Asian woman, like being portrayed either as you're the dragon lady or you're a prostitute. Right. And it's like, unfortunately for Asian men, it was like the nerd, similar with Asian women too. It's like if you're the one token character, maybe you're like the nerdy girl. And so it is really like back then growing up, I don't think you realize it because it's like you're just in the moment and you don't know any better. And so you don't know what there is beyond that until you actually see it. And so I am super hopeful. So I have three kids. My oldest is 18. I have a 15-year-old and then a 3-year-old. And so I know
whoa,
for
wait,
sure they are growing up in such a different age. And I'm obviously have been very vocal about Asian issues and I talk with them a lot about it. And so I just know also because I have, we've chosen to live places that are quite diverse. They obviously have not had the same experience that I did, but I think that I've really made sure that they have a good perspective on where they came from, that it's like it was not always this way, and like we do need to be appreciative but always constantly pushing too, because I look at what's happening today and like even though it is miles better than what it was even 5 years ago, we're still not there yet. And so I think that unless we keep pushing, it's actually not going to keep getting better and better,
mm-hmm.
because unfortunately there are still a lot of companies, brands, entertainment companies, producers, directors, whoever, where they still kind of look at diversity as like a checklist to check off, that
Yeah.
it's like, we've got our one token Asian, and it's like, it's usually an East Asian person, whatever, who maybe has like sort of more Western features, without thinking about AAPI and like Asianness on like a gigantic spectrum, right? That it's like it's not all just about having your one token East Asian. It's like, what about our South Asians? What about our Native Hawaiians? And so I don't think that most non-Asian people understand like the incredibly wide spectrum of what we look like. That it's like it's different hair textures and hair colors and skin colors and body shapes, and not all of us have the same eyes. And so I think that that's going to take a little bit more time for us to like make sure that we're educating people. And again, like it moves into that whole, are we being seen as like full people?
Right. Like, how do you, because this is a question that it's like we can identify when it looks like just the diversity box is being ticked, like whether it's a movie or within schools with, it's just still, there's this like feeling of, it hasn't really penetrated into like, any sort of depth. And there's this feeling of, oh, well, as long as you can see a little bit more, our work is done. Not necessarily from Asian people, but maybe like the DEI committee at a school or at a company or something like that. And I feel like during the pandemic, many companies went full in on like DEI, right? Like maybe they didn't have one, or they just like spent more energy in it. And I think people struggle to figure out, well, how do you actually find true progress here? Like, how do you actually do more than tick diversity boxes? And I don't know how to answer that question either. And maybe partly it's just time and having having more people telling their diverse stories and being able to listen to, like, well, this person is from this background and this person's from that background. And do you think it's just sort of like, it's something that's just going to take a lot of time? Like, there's
So
no
it'll
easy
take some
answer.
time. Yeah, there's no easy answer for sure. I think it'll take time, but I also think part of it is having people who are in decision-making roles who are of different communities, right? And so it doesn't have to be just, you have to have an Asian person, you have to have a Black person, you have to have a Latina. It's more that what I've seen even in my own like executive career is that other people of various communities, if you have ever felt marginalized, you tend to also want to help bring up other people as well. Right. And so I think that there's been this great movement, and we're not there yet, but like there has been this great movement of trying to diversify boards, like corporate boards, to try and bring up more executive women, specifically of color. And so I think that it is pretty clear in a lot of instances that, again, like those people tend to open the door a bit more and also just be more open to seeing things that maybe are blind spots for other people. And so I think that's one very good thing to do. It has concerned me a little bit though, that it's like, I feel like you said, we've seen sort of like this big push towards like, DEI and everything. And now I have been hearing, but also kind of reading that there are a lot of major companies that are starting to scale back because, economy starts to get difficult. And it's like one of the places where they feel like they can cut budget is unfortunately on a lot of those programs. And so I do think that it requires a lot of people, again, either who are in decision-making roles or even just at literally any level, to make sure that they are loud about making sure that their company understands that it is still really important.
Yeah. You work with Lean In. Do you still work with that organization? Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Sure. So, I'm not like fully associated with them, but I did work on a program with them. They had done some research related to Asian American women and
Yeah.
how we really, women in general obviously are paid less than men, but specifically with Asian American women, also we are really underpaid when compared to what men are making. And so I just really believed in like the research that they were doing, and also just the messaging. And so we worked together on an Instagram post to put out there about the research. And so that was great. I in the past probably 5 years have become so vocal about Asian American issues that it was just something that really made sense.
And what inspired that? Was it, I mean, obviously it's something you've always cared about because of our identity, right? It's inherent, but like, was it as you were finding success in your own work? And I'm sure that was so, I want to hear more about how you got to the level of like being editor in chief of some huge magazine, where I can't imagine there were that many Asian women in high roles. Like, it must have been, was it like such a fight to get there? And what?
Yeah, it's really interesting. So I just did a keynote at this event with Meta last week, and it was their first ever API Beauty Summit. And so I looked out into this room, and it was almost all Asian Americans and then some allies. But I remember saying during it, I was like, I've actually never been in a room like this before,
Wow.
right? That it's like, I've been in a room of Asian Americans, I've been in a room of beauty people, but I've actually never been in a room before of Asian American beauty people. And so someone did bring up the point, and I actually had never really thought about it before, but there were a bunch of other former editors there too, who they were telling their personal story of, when I was starting out in this industry, there was nobody who looked like me. And I'm going to be quite honest with you, I didn't really think about it that much until
Mm.
that moment where I was like, actually, when I was starting out, was there even one person who looked like me? There was one person, my very first job in New York City, when I worked at Glamour, there was an editor, Maggie, who was like a fashion associate or something like that. She worked in the fashion closet, and I remember her. But besides that, to be quite honest with you, I don't remember seeing one other Asian face for probably 10 plus years, which is crazy, right? And so Eva Chen at some point kind of came around, and like, you know, she and I were sort of like, I guess like the quote unquote most prominent Asians in media at some point. And now there's so many more. But it is kind of crazy. But I don't know, maybe it's a little bit of internalized racism or something, that it's like at that age when I was first starting out, you know, I'm in my early 20s, mid 20s, everything. I didn't really think about race that much. And so I didn't really think about, is being Asian American something that's holding me back? I think I was just in New York City, hustling, struggling, you know what I mean, trying to make it. And I even back in those days, it just was not done. People didn't talk about diversity. You didn't try and cover somebody who frankly was like non-white. Like there was sort of this unspoken rule that I did hear spoken a couple of times about how on magazine covers, if you're not white, you don't sell. Right. And so people didn't push back on that back in those days. It's just there was a handful of models and celebrities who were on every single cover, and it was quite boring because everyone just had the same covers over and over again. And so it wasn't until I became an editor in chief that I think I started to really question that. And so when I got the job at Allure, when I was still interviewing, actually, I did a little presentation, a little PowerPoint, like, you know, here's what I would do to change the brand. And, you know, when I was still interviewing for the job, the first thing that I had was diversity. And so I explained why that was important. And so remember, this was like 2015, not that long ago. You did not see diversity on magazine covers, like in ads and entertainment, et cetera. Like it's actually wild to think about how far we've come since then. And so from the get-go, you know, I got the job and we started to really get to work on like, okay, what does this look like? And it was, what's interesting to think about is that back in those days, again, like you think about sort of the whole ecosystem of a magazine cover, and you had the Jennifer Anistons of the world, you know what I mean? It's like the sort of A-list magazine stars who were on every single cover. It's a whole ecosystem because back then in 2015, who were the prominent Asian American actresses, right? There was no Gemma Chan back then. There was no Aquafina. Like now we see like a whole bunch of people, but it just didn't really exist. So part of pushing that had to become not only like, okay, you as an editor have to sort of like take the initiative and do it, but it's also, we kind of have to help make certain stars too. And it's a whole, that's what I'm saying. It's a whole ecosystem that it's like, when it comes to getting models for shoots and everything, it requires then the modeling agencies to make sure that they're also doing their part in sort of pushing diversity too. And so that's my very long-winded way of saying, I don't think that I thought that much in my earlier career about how being Asian American either affected me or didn't affect me. But I will say, I think that now that I look back on it in hindsight, I think a lot of it did end up driving me, that I never, you know, when I was first starting out being an editor, I never thought that I would be an editor in chief. Like I was kind of the quintessential, like Asian American stereotype of the girl where it's like, I was kind of shy and like, I was nervous about speaking up in meetings. I didn't want to rock the boat. And to be quite honest, I feel like I got to the point that I was from one, really hard work, but two, definitely a lot of luck, and three, a lot of really great people believing in me. And you know, does that happen to everybody? It's like there's so few editor-in-chief jobs. It's really, really difficult to get into those. And so I do credit a lot of luck to that. But I do think that once I got it, I was like, okay, I really have to do something with this and make sure that I do things that get people's attention.
Well, I mean, it requires so much belief in wanting to put forward more Asian faces and stories when it's not something that's been done overall in our culture, let alone within fashion, beauty, magazine world. You must have just had such strong belief in, hey, this is important. Like we are important. We need to be seen. And that's like quite a like renegade thing to think back then. Cause if I'm thinking back to like, my mind just slipped back to 2015. I was like, when did Crazy Rich Asians come out? Because I feel like that was
2018.
Right. That was like a cultural turning point too, where I'm like, everyone loved it, saw that Asians, it was a full Asian cast, right? It was, I think it was, and like it could be really cool and beautiful. And so that was a moment. But yeah, 2015 was before then. And like the gumption it must have taken for you to be like, I'm gonna do this. And did you get pushback, or were the people that you happened to be around just like very progressive, open-minded? Like,
Yeah. So I will be quite honest with you. I didn't start off with let me broaden people's horizons and increase representation of Asian Americans, right? I actually, when I think back about like 2016, et cetera, we were pushing diversity in a lot of different ways. And so 2017 became sort of like a really pivotal year for us. This was during the height of like the Trump Muslim travel ban and other things. And so we had one cover during that year that like really took off. We had Halima Aden, who's a model, in a hijab on the cover with the cover line, "This is American Beauty Now." And so we were doing tons of like, we really wanted to make sure that like diversity across the board was like, seen. And like, that was our thing. Was before I got the job, I really took a step back and thought, I'm actually not a beauty person. Like most of my background, actually, I'm very much a generalist. So I started out, I worked in a bunch of women's magazines that had fashion and beauty, et cetera, but that was never specifically my beat. I have covered literally everything. Like people's eyes kind of go, wow, when I talk about it, but I covered finance, tech, health, parenting. I was a cars editor at some point. I've written about extreme sports. I covered snowboarding. I literally have covered so many different things. I was a music editor, an entertainment editor. And so I look at beauty through the lens of culture. And so I initially was a little bit self-conscious about like, I'm not a pure beauty person. Can I lead a beauty magazine? When actually, I think in hindsight, again, it was really an asset for me because it meant that I wasn't just looking at beauty through like the traditional lens of products and treatments, et cetera, even though I love those things, but I was also looking at it through the lens of what does beauty really mean? And so when I really distilled down what is beauty, it actually is incredibly political, right? Because if you think about it, has everything to do with race, skin color, gender, body, gender identity, sexuality, everything. And so it's all about our physical appearance. And so what is our physical appearance? It's race, right? And so how could we be a beauty publication without talking about race and without representing people as they are? And so the first cover, I think, that really made a splash for us, we literally used the line, and again, this was like not done back then. We called it the beauty of diversity. And we had three models on there who all sort of represented different skin tones. And again, at the time, you very rare, I can't even think of one cover of seeing like a very, very dark skinned Black woman. And so, three models, gorgeous. But what I loved about it was, again, we kind of flipped it on its head. That at that time specifically, I grew up in women's magazines, and like, the cliche cover story was always, you meet the cover star and you have lunch and here's what they're eating and then it's a very fluffy story. What I loved about that story was I had said to my team, I really want to get real raw quotes from women. And so we had, I think it was like, we got 41 women of color talking about racism, colorism, and like, it went there. Like it was raw and real. And it was, again, it was sort of like turning the magazine cover story on its head, rather than just having these fluffy interviews with our three cover stars, which we certainly could have done. We really wanted to like change the narrative about things. And so that's why I say it's like we did a lot of things before it even really stuck to me that like, in the back of my mind, I was kind of like, boy, it really sucks that we don't have better Asian American representation on a lot of things. Right.
Yeah.
But then I had to actually go, well, wait a second, what is wrong with me? And like, if anyone's going to do it, why is it not me? Right. And so again, it's like, I say that because we all have our own blind spots. And to me, because I had been so programmed to think at some point that people are not going to care about our stories, even I fell victim to that too. And so I had to actually break myself out of that. And then after that, then we went full nuts and we just started like we had so many Asian covers, etc. And so the one that I think a lot of people still talk about is for our hair issue, we had 3 Asian models and gorgeous, gorgeous cover. The cover itself had actually nothing to do with them being Asian. We just cast 3 Asian models for it. And so when I was writing my editor's letter for that issue, I looked back at the past 28 years, I think, and like 327 covers of Allure that had come before that. And there had only been 2 Asian women on the cover of Allure prior to that. And so in one issue, we blew that number away. And so actually prior to that, there was another shoot that we did in digital. So we had an editor, Sable Yong, who's Asian American, and she wanted to do a shoot, a beauty shoot with monolids. And again, think back, this was like, I don't know, 2016 or something. When did you ever see anything that even referenced monolids? For me, growing up in the 80s, like I remember 80s and 90s, like being frustrated because reading magazines and books and stuff, you would always see like the directions for how to do eye makeup. And they would say, put this color in the crease. And I'm like, what crease? I don't have a crease.
Right. Yeah.
And so we did this gorgeous shoot. We cast, models that had monolids, and it was all about like these gorgeous, like super artistic, but also just like beautiful eye looks. And then we cast an all Asian crew. We had an all Asian crew working on it. And the photographer, Peter Ashley, who's like an incredible photographer, I ran into him later that year. It's probably maybe like a whole year after that at an event, actually at Apex for Youth. And he and his sister came up to me and they were like, that shoot that we did for Allure, that actually inspired me so much that we created our own magazine out of that. And so I don't know if you've ever heard of Burdock. So they created Burdock magazine, which is like by Asians for Asians. It's beautiful, gorgeous indie magazine because they were so inspired by that one shoot. Wow. And so I often use that example because it's really easy, like as a editor, as a creative or anything, that like you're very busy, right? Like as an editor, you're doing a million things, you're kind of on to the next thing. And you forget sometimes that people are seeing what you're working on and like what you've put out into the world. And so I just say that because it's really, you can put out one thing and kind of be on to the next, but not realize actually that that one thing is really inspiring other people. And then what they're creating is inspiring other people. And so it has been this awesome effect of like people sparking each other. And, you mentioned Crazy Rich Asians before. To me, that was such a pivotal moment as well, because even though like we have been doing so much work, I think, after that time when I counted the 2 Asians on the cover of Lore, after that, I think we had 10 Asians on the cover in like the next coming years. But I still felt like, as I mentioned before, there's a whole ecosystem that has to happen in order for those things to, to kind of come about, that there have to be then Asian American actresses who then can go on to the cover, and then models and et cetera. And I never really felt like there was a strong Asian American community, at least that I had been a part of. I have a gigantic family. And so I whenever we would do Christmas and Thanksgiving and stuff, there was the time I would see a lot of Asians. But besides that, in my professional career, in my personal life, like I really didn't see Asian Americans that much. Crazy Rich Asians to me was the time that really changed. And so for the premiere of that movie, it was the first time that like I had heard Gold House, right? And so I got involved with Gold House at that point. And so there was this amazing screening that the AAPI fashion community in New York City held, and we all got together. And it was so amazing because there were these people who I've admired for such a long time, from fashion designers, et cetera. And it was the first time that we ever really got together as a group. And what was wonderful too is that we all kind of used that one galvanizing moment and kept it going. And so, I'm sure you've heard of Gold House, but like I have been involved in that organization from almost the very beginning. Prabal Gurung actually and I hosted the very first salon for Gold House in New York City. Has come so far. I remember we were on like a fold out table. We had like takeout food and stuff. But it's like, again, having these, I think it was like 20 people around these 2 fold out tables from various industries and stuff, who all really expressed, we really have always been looking for this community, and like, what can we do to help one another? What can we do to build community? It has been so wonderful to see that even from 2018 to, again, now, not that long, how much that has grown and how much I now feel like we have such a strong community.
Yeah, I actually only found out about Gold House earlier this year. And as I was going back and looking at everything they've done, I'm like, well, I mean, I could say, well, pandemic and I had a baby, but I'm like, have I just been living under the biggest rock that as an Asian person, like a proud Asian American, just somehow didn't know? But um, yeah, now I'm just like, wow, this organization is incredible. And um, yeah, what did they do at was it in the spring or the beginning of their A100 list? That's when I first, I think that was when I
Yeah,
first
and
started
so
finding about it.
Gold House, like I said, has grown enormously. I think where most people know them from was as a program called Gold Open. And so that was with like Crazy Rich Asians. They've done it with Parasite, Everything Everywhere All at Once, lots of movies where they will sort of, again, like, gather a lot of like Asian American support to try and buy out theaters and make sure that a movie becomes really successful, that it's like we show that it's like through unity and through strength, that it's like these are movies that people really want to see. But then now it's really moved on to other programs as well. There's the A100 list, which names like the 100, 100 like really prominent Asian Americans and like amazing things that they did that year. There's Gold Rush, which is like helping Asian American businesses, et cetera. And so it really, now the past 2 years, there's been Gold Gala, which is sort of like the Asian American Met Gala, if you will. And so that, again, has been sort of incredible to see that, like, again, starting out on a fold-out table with like
Yeah.
food, going to now like a huge gala has been really awesome.
That's amazing. Well, I wanted to go back really quickly to you were saying when you first joined as editor of Allure and you knew you wanted to bring more diversity, but that it wasn't specifically Asian. Like you didn't see it that way yet. It was more like a broader concept of diversity. And then you made a comment earlier about internalized racism.
Mhm.
And I feel there's a lot of things that I look back for myself and feel similarly. Like I only realized in hindsight, wait, I was the only Asian person in that whatever situation. And it's kind of like, how could I like not have noticed how? And I think I mean, I don't really know what it is. Maybe part of it is like having bought into the model minority myth and the concept of white adjacency, this feeling of like, we're basically white, like they like white culture, white supremacy, or whatever we want to call it, like allows us to, they don't discriminate against us in the same ways that this discrimination manifests against Black and brown people. So I don't know if it was sort of like this, like, let me just not see myself truly what I don't, and like, and as a mom, I mean, my husband's white, so my kids are mixed race, but they look very Korean, in my opinion. And most people say they just look, I mean, they just are undeniably Asian looking. And I just want them to know that and not ever be in this like, hey, pretend you're not Asian and like, just lean into your white side or anything. And it's beautiful, but it's also kind of like I feel sad for the little myself,
Yeah.
and yeah.
Yeah, I hear you. I think in my case, because I had such a hard time being Asian when I was younger, right? Like I've talked about this in some other interviews as well, that it actually took me until my mid 20s. Like I went to therapy when I was 25, and I had been holding on to a lot of like trauma and anger and like frankly just like straight up rage, I think, and hurt too. And so I unraveled a lot of it at that point. And I remember like crying like a little girl in, therapy, like when I was 25, talking about like being bullied when I was in seventh grade. And I'm like, first of all, it's a really hard thing to go through where you're 25. I was already pretty successful, right? I'm like, I'm living the life in New York City. I was a senior editor at the time at Glamour. I had just written a book. Um, and like, why am I still crying about something that happened in seventh grade? And it was because like a lot of that hurt really just like I internalized it. And I, as opposed to like feeling like the bullies were the bad ones, I had internalized it as I was the bad one. And so there was something really wrong with me. The fact that one, I couldn't protect myself, but two, that it's like I just must be faulty in some way because these kids like called me an ugly chink. Right. And so it's really hard until you like unravel some of like that weird childhood stuff, you don't totally get it. And so it is hard. And I feel like, again, I think that your kids and our, my own kids and stuff, like ideally they're never going to grow up with stuff like that. But I did feel like, up until, so from seventh grade to when I was 25, let's say, because of that stuff that I was holding on to, I very actively tried to ignore my Asianness. And so when it came to, for example, having Asian friends and other things, not that I was like so thoughtful behind, I never want to have Asian friends or whatever, but it was more like it wasn't what I was seeking out, because it was more that for self-preservation, I wanted to protect myself and not be perceived as being quote unquote overly Asian, right? And that's messed up. Like that's really messed up. And that is that internalized racism. And so it took me a very, very long time to like really get over that. And even still, it's like it still took me a very long time that in my professional life that I really leaned into my Asianness and thought like, this is really messed up. Like, why are we as a community not doing this more? And it did just require like a lot of guts, frankly. And you had asked before, like, were the people around me just like super progressive? Like, was there pushback, etc.? There really was not pushback. I think that because, I never would have called myself a risk taker. Like I, even as a kid and stuff, I wasn't like the adrenaline seeking kid who was like always the risk taker. Like I'm a relatively like calm, sane person. But when it comes to creative work and my job, I can be kind of a risk taker. And I realized that a lot of times with like magazines, people were always like very concerned with what they called single copy sales, right? And so that was when everything was dependent on the newsstand, and you could sort of, that was like your analytics, is how you would measure if an issue did well or didn't do well, was your single copy sales. To me, I was like less concerned with how a story or how a cover or anything was selling in that moment, because I looked at it as a bigger picture, that it's like, it's okay. And so if we're painting an overall picture of like what it is that we want to do, and so my mission was really, I wanted to change the world by changing and challenging beauty standards, right? And so if I looked at the entire year, it becomes less of like a stress of saying this issue did well, this didn't do well, da 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 da, because like we were getting the overall message across that I really wanted to portray. And so in that sense, I felt really fearless. And I felt like I had the support of the people around me. I felt like I had the support of my bosses and other people. Occasionally, there would be some editors who maybe would question things. And so there was actually a cover that I did want to do actually after Atlanta, which I'm not going to actually give the idea because I do actually want to do it at some point somehow. But it's hard because when you so strongly believe in something and you're of that community, you do have to sometimes like convince other people of things. But luckily, the other editors who I worked with, quite frankly, they were the ones who pushed me. Like, I feel like oftentimes they would have ideas that like really push the limits, and I would be scared because I was sort of like, oh, I don't know, is it okay if we do this? And so I think that's equally as important too, is that to make sure that you surround yourself with people who push you as well, and like make sure that you get out of your comfort zone.
I think it's a really good time for young people who are entering whatever career, because there are so many people outside, like you said, you mentioned allies, who like, whether they're mixed race or white or just not Asian, find it a priority to make sure that we are finding more equity, more racial equity, and like, so I feel like people are excited to be a part of this, even if they're not necessarily Asian or have any ties. What did you study? What did you study by? Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. Oh no, I was gonna say the thing that I want us to all still push for is when it comes to intersectionality. And so
Mm.
intersectionality obviously can mean a lot of different things. It could be, you know, LGBTQ, whatever. But it's also even as much as like age too. Like I feel like, you know, we were talking about tokenism before, and like I feel like oftentimes if you see like an Asian American person, like they're young, but it's like even in campaigns and stuff like that, I just want to make sure that it's like, let's see some like gray or like white haired Asians as well, right? And so I think in those ways, that's what I mean is like we all have to kind of still be like pushing, because
Mm.
we all have our own blind spots too.
Well, because it's really easy to celebrate like the hot 25 Asian model of the moment or actress of
Yeah,
the
the K-pop
moment, right?
stars.
Right. Oh my gosh, the K-pop stars, of course. But like, wait, what's this whole human story behind like our people is important. And we're still only getting little fragments. It's good. We're getting more now, but it's still quite limited and pushing for the broader range. I like you were you asked for like, let's ban the use of the term anti-aging, right? Which is so I mean, it just goes against living, like it just goes against everything. Cause like, what? No, you want to age, you want to be live. And the opposite of anti-aging is to not be able to live really. So
Yeah,
it's,
exactly. And so that was a great example of how people on my team really sort of like helped me to think in different ways and like really pushed me. And it was actually two members of my staff. One was our digital director at the time, and then the other was our executive beauty director, who kind of simultaneously in different meetings mentioned it also, like, why do we still even say anti-aging? Like, that's such a weird thing. And so back then, this was like 2017. We actually had a vertical on our website that was called anti-aging, because that's how much anti-aging was just like in everything in beauty, on packaging, on everything. And so as we started to explore what, like, it's a word, right? And we should say, oh, words can't hurt us, whatever. But it was more that it's like the thought process around, what are we really saying when we're saying anti-aging? It does mean specifically for women that aging is something that's bad and we should fight tooth and nail against it. And so if you are getting older and you're aging and you're showing it, you are unworthy and blah, blah. And so as we started to like delve into that, it just did become clear that it was something that we should take a stand on. But it was an example of how I was nervous, right? So we were like getting ready to publish it. We had this cover with Helen Mirren. I did the cover story. My editor's letter was where we said, we're going to stop using the term anti-aging. We're banning it. People had a lot of questions. It was like, does that mean you're not going to write about Botox? Does it mean you're not going to cover products that are called anti-aging? Not the case. It was more that we as a brand, we're not going to say anti-aging in like our vertical. We're not going to use it as like the best anti-aging products. When I tell you, it was the most talked about thing we have ever done. I still have people reach out to me saying like, thank you so much for doing that. It became global news, and it really changed the way that people talk about, and I hope think about, age. After that, I don't pretend that like we were the ones who were like changed everything, but I do think it made people talk and think. And so now in the past couple of years, I have seen more older models, models over 60, let's say, on the runway, in campaigns, people who are not afraid to let their gray show and their white show. And like, that's been wonderful to be able to even think that like we were a part of that is really great.
Yeah. Thinking of like just, like you mentioned Jennifer Aniston earlier, Jennifer Lopez, all the women that I looked up to when I was a teenager that were just like like a decade older than me. And like when they hit 50, which before when I was younger, 50 felt like, oh, that's the end of your life. Now you're, you're done. And seeing like, no, wow, they are absolutely still in their prime, and just a total reorganization of what age means. I saw also Jamila Jamil posted something about the faces in Los Angeles and how it was frightening that everybody was getting, and she's, same as what you're saying. She's like, if people want to do Botox or plastic surgery, that's fine. But like, she's like, I think I need to get out of LA because all I'm seeing are the same sort of, like anti-aging attempt, like this face. And she's like, this is not normal. This is like,
Yeah.
where are all the aging faces? And she's a big proponent of like aging gracefully. And Do you see that living in LA? Do you feel like it's really noticeable compared to, New York? I mean,
Oh, it is definitely super noticeable here. I think a lot of people call it Instagram face, that it's sort
oh
of like you
God.
just sort of walk out and it looks like, that surgery that a lot of people had recently, I think it's called buckle, even though I like to call it buckle fat removal, where it's like you
Uh,
just look super sculpted here. Like you definitely see a lot of that, see a lot of, filler and etc. And listen, I don't, my whole thing when it comes to beauty and skincare and everything is you do you, right? And so I think that was one of the things that, like, with the whole end of anti-aging thing, got kind of like misinterpreted too, is that we weren't saying to people like, don't do Botox, don't do that stuff. It's more that I would love for everyone to do things because they want to do it, as opposed to society is telling them you are going to be, unloved and unworthy if you don't do it.
mhm.
And so, if that's what people want to do, absolutely. But it's certainly here in LA. It is a different vibe. And I do feel like there's probably social pressure that, because, it's like keeping up with the Joneses. It's not even anymore like you have to buy the hot car or whatever. It's like you got to have the hot face.
Yeah. Oh man. Before we finish, so you opened your own agency, Monologue?
I did. I did. So
And
we
yeah,
moved to LA. After I left Allure, I was a VP at Netflix.
yes, that's
And
right.
so this year I had left there and I started my own agency called Monologue. And so I really missed like a lot of the creative work and also working with beauty brands. And so Monologue was really, first of all, finding a name for anything these days is really difficult.
So
That was like the
hard.
hardest part. I feel like I landed on something that, like, my background is really storytelling. Like I feel like when I think about editorial, but also marketing and other things, it's so much about telling a story. And so Monologue sort of became that thing of like, it's one person's story, it's one brand's story. Also, I liked that it had ML, which is my initials in it.
Oh yeah.
Um,
Oh, I love that.
so yeah, so our goal basically is to help consumer brands tell their stories. And so I'm working with beauty brands and also lifestyle brands at various stages. Like I love working with some of the newer brands where, they're just getting started, but I also love working with some of the established ones as well. And like, how do you then, as either like a new brand or an older brand, an established brand, how do you tell your story? Whether it is on social media, whether it's through written content, whether it's through PR, whether it's through big marketing campaigns. And so one of the things that makes me really happy is that I had this fear that after leaving editorial, right? Like editorial is very much about unbridled creativity. You put something out into the world because you dream it up and then you just do it, right? Like that's the bulk of it. You want to tell a story, awesome. Like there's very few constraints. Whereas when you work at a brand, there's a lot more constraints because you can tell a story, but you obviously have like a little bit more of a box that you have to work within. What I love though is that it's really possible to do brand work that's incredibly wildly creative, but that also sends a message too. So one of the first projects that I worked on when I started consulting was I did a project with Ulta Beauty that the genesis of
Mm.
it was really this thought. Um, what does it mean to look Asian? And so my husband is Filipino, and people often say, "Oh, you don't look Filipino," or "You don't look Asian." I was like, "What does
Right.
that mean? What does that mean?" Right? And
What does
so
that mean?
people probably think, especially if they're not Asian, they think that looking Asian looks like you and me, right? That it's East Asian, we've got black hair, somewhat fair skin, when actually looking Asian is a gigantic spectrum of what people look like. And so I worked on this campaign with Ulta Beauty where it was in celebration of Asian Pacific American Heritage Month. And so on different levels, you could look at it in different ways. I worked with an amazing Asian American photographer. And so together we cast about 20 people and we wanted to represent a gigantic spectrum of what we look like. So we had different skin colors, different hair textures, different body types, different gender identities, and ages too. So I cast a Bangladeshi grandma. I had an activist who is half Afro-Latina and half Japanese. And so she has like, amazing natural curls. There was a makeup artist, actually Ariana Grande's makeup artist, I'm sorry, hairstylist, who he's non-binary and he's Mexican and Chinese.
Mm.
And so the day of the shoot was fabulous. Like the vibes were amazing. Everyone was super happy. We shot some video for it as well. But what I loved is that, again, you could sort of view this campaign in different levels. One, it is just a beautiful celebration of Asian beauty. Amazing, done, pass it over, great. But on another level, I hope that it challenged some people to think differently. That is like, even as Asian Americans too, right? Like, again, we have to challenge our own biases and think about our own blind spots, that maybe that's not what I thought Asian Americans looked like. That actually, whoa, it's a much broader range of people than I previously had thought. And so I say that because, again, like doing brand work, like I want people to make sure that they're constantly pushing to that, like you can do these things, that like you're presenting the brand that you're working for in a great way. You're presenting their values, you're presenting beauty, hair, makeup, whatever it is that you're trying to sell, but you're also sending another message that can also benefit society in a different way too.
I just had chills through that whole thing. It's so I loved your vision, and that you are pushing things forward. You want it to go beyond whether it's the magazine cover, the story, or a brand moment. The important thing is that, like, what is it going to take on next, and how is it going to take shape next? Because it is important to keep growing it. And we're really lucky to have you like that. You may not have paid attention to it when you were early on in your career, like how important the Asian part of your identity is, but obviously you do now. And I'm so glad. I'm just like, and you give inspiration to the rest of us to be like, hey, yeah, this is important. It's important to add our voices to this and really get rid of the idea of Asians looking a certain way or being a monolith, or any of that. And as you were saying, like, what does it mean to be Asian or look Asian? So as I've been doing this podcast, like I had like an Indian American guest, and some of my friends were like they had to take a moment, like, wait, I thought you were interviewing Asian people, and it's like, oh wait, because like you think East Asian, most people are thinking East Asian. They assume that I'm obviously East Asian, so there's that assumption.
Yep.
And I've had funny conversations with people like, well, actually it's, not just about India, but other Asian countries. And people are just being like, oh, right. And it's good. It's good to have these conversations. And
Totally. And honestly, I mean, you probably know this as well, but it's like even the term AAPI or Asian American is like somewhat controversial in some circles, because we do tend to emphasize one ethnicity or like one group of Asians over another. And so in that Ulta campaign, we made sure that we cast someone who is Native Hawaiian as well. And like, I think that's the thing, is that like people don't realize, even us in our own community don't realize that it's like we're sort of emphasizing certain cultures and then ignoring others. And if we are going to really grow a strong community, we can't do that. And we can't just look at the success of AAPI. We also have to make sure that we're bringing up other people. And like, that's when I think, again, the Atlanta spa murders really brought up a lot of interesting points, that it's like, I think that initially a lot of the AAPI community, it's very easy to sort of celebrate success. And like, we want to make sure we get more Asian Americans on boards and like have more Asian representation in movies and stuff like that. But also, if we're not helping people who are still coming up, and maybe are like living under the poverty line, or like others, it's like, it's not actually helping everybody. And so I think that's the other thing that we constantly have to be thinking about too, is that it's not just about success. Like, we have to make sure that we're pulling others up too.
Yeah. And I think being Asian, we're better at like the positive storytelling, like the stuff where you can you have something to brag about or be congratulated for, because we've grown up with this, like, achieve, be successful, that's like such a huge thing. And then we don't really have the like experience of talking about the hard stuff, the scary stuff, the bad stuff, just like, for sure. I hope I'm doing what I can to make it different for my children. And I think it's a different thing for this younger generation, but we grew up like not having, we have no literacy around that from like when we grew up. And so it's harder to talk about the, like the
Oh,
not
totally.
so.
And I think, unfortunately, a lot of us grew, not unfortunately, listen, our parents did
It
the
just
right thing
is.
by us,
Yeah.
right? They did what they needed
Yeah.
to do. Culturally, I think that in certain Asian cultures, it is sort of, and maybe this is even just immigrant mentality in general. Put your head down, work hard, don't talk about the hardships, and like you're going to be successful. You got to just keep going, don't complain. And so that mentality was ingrained in a lot of us. And so now it does become difficult to talk about struggle, to talk about mental health. And so I do feel like now, especially this year, I feel like I've seen more conversation happening about mental health within our community too, that it's just something that, especially with like men, a
Mm.
lot of people are not talking about and they need to.
Have you seen that film Liquor Store Dreams? Have you heard of that?
No.
It's a documentary made by this young Korean American woman about her parents' liquor store in Koreatown in LA. And it goes into like the LA, the riots of 1992, I believe. It's like that's a big focal point of it. When do you remember it was like the Rodney King verdict was
Mhm.
read, and
Yep.
it goes into the pitting against of Koreans and Black folks,
Yep.
and just like I was like bawling through the film because it expresses so much of what it's been like to grow up Asian American and like having all these feelings or all these assumptions, and um even ones where we're like we and our families are the ones that were had our racist beliefs, and just the pain that comes with carrying that, not knowing what to do with it, and then not having a space to release it. And and I highly recommend that film.
Yeah. I
It's
will
so
totally look that
lovely.
up.
Yeah, it's small. Like it's I heard about it. I think it came like I saw a trailer on Instagram before it was coming out, and it was around the same time that Past Lives
Mhm.
was advertised. I just saw them at the same
Oh,
time,
so
and
it's
that
relatively new.
it's new.
Okay.
It's new. It's like for early. I think it's from earlier this year. But I Past Lives. This is like a small documentary, like the Liquor
Yeah.
Store Dreams one. So I don't think many people have even heard of it, but it is so good and tells like, and even though it centers around this specific family, I think many Asian Americans can relate to, just like the story of that. And it's a lot about, she's interviewing her father, who is an immigrant Korean man, and forcing him, not forcing, but like he's willingly participating, but like really pushing him to have like talk about like what he felt, and the prejudices he himself had. And then and I think it even goes into like the pandemic and agent hate crimes and the looting that happened then too, and just like how messy it is, but how much ultimately we want to be in community, not just with our Asian American Pacific Islanders, but like we really just want to be included, and we want to include other people. And it's just, yeah, I mean, it's just so important. And it's the way that we have to keep moving forward. And
Yeah.
I think I mean, that's like that's like the best of humanity if we can keep doing that, right?
Well, you said something before about how it's like there's no easy answers. And when it comes to, stop Asian hate, it's another instance in which there's no easy answers, because if you actually sit with it and say, how can we solve this problem? I don't know that any of us have like the answer. If one of us did, please speak up because I would love to know that answer. And so it goes back to like a whole ecosystem, right? That it's like, unfortunately, it's not going to be one magic pill that like fixes everything. It is that it's like we as a community have to like make constant change and like not let our foot off the gas.
That's hard sometimes because you get tired, right? You get tired of being like, like we deserve to be here. See us, stop tokenizing us or objectifying us. You get tired, but we have to keep going. Like we
Yeah.
have to
I
be
mean,
the ones.
the thing that makes me hopeful though is that if you think about everything that's happened in the past 5 years and we look at the progress of the past 5 years, that's crazy
Mm,
actually. Like to think about if in the next 5 years, if we can keep that level of
mm.
progress up, we will be in a much better spot.
That's a really good point. And a really good point to end on, I think. Thank you, Michelle. You had so much wonderful perspective to share. And I love seeing that, like, you you've had this amazing career, and as you've gotten, older and being a mother now, like you're really incorporating stuff about your identity and our AAPI community into all the work that you do. And that just helps elevate, and inspire and motivate everybody else. So I think, yeah, I'm so happy we got to have this conversation.
Thank you. This has been lovely. And I feel like we could have talked for another 2 hours,
I
but
know. I hope.
thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, thank you. And maybe I will meet you someday at some wonderful community event. I would love
Would
that.
love that.
Yeah. All right. I will it's probably going to take a few weeks to edit and everything, and I will get in touch with you again, probably just to check about, like, I'll either pull a photo maybe from Instagram, or if you have something you specifically want to use just for when I like promote it. I'll probably just email you. Is it fine just to email you directly for that? Is that
Totally.
best?
Yeah, totally.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you so
And
much.
no interruptions from
I
from children.
know.
I was kind of
And then
like,
cute children.
I know exactly. All right. Have a great rest of your day.
You too. Bye.
Bye.